Brilliant. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Government. Thank you for joining us. My name is Tim Durrant. I lead our work here on the role of government ministers, and I am really excited to be hosting this event, talking about how ministers can succeed in their roles and how they can progress through them. A few weeks ago, we heard rumours of a summer reshuffle. We were just saying earlier, we think maybe that's going to be sort of delayed until the autumn. But whether there's one on the cards or not, we are coming up to the one-year anniversary of this government. So it is a chance for the PM and his team to think about how his ministers are performing and what he wants from his government team. So we thought it was a good opportunity to talk about what is it like being a minister, how ministers succeed in government, and what skills they need at each rung of the ministerial career ladder, and particularly how they get to the cabinet table. We're also going to have a sort of bit of a discussion about how the PM and his close team make decisions about who should serve in government and what they're looking for in their ministers. So we have a fantastic panel to discuss this, if I work from that side to this side. So we have Right Honourable James Purnell, who is CEO of Flint Global. He was former Secretary of State for Work and Pensions and Culture, Media and Sport in the last Labour government, and he was Labour MP for Stalybridge and Hyde. Kitty Donaldson, who is Chief Political Commentator at The Eye, which she joined last year. Previously, she was Political Editor at Bloomberg. And the Right Honourable Lucy Fraser KC, former Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, various other ministerial roles as well, and Conservative MP for South East Cambridgeshire until July last year. So we have plenty of time for discussion. We'll kick off with a bit of a conversation between the panel. I'll open to the floor for questions. Those of you online, if you'd like to start sending in your questions now, we've got someone moderating those. So please do drop in questions throughout. And if you are on social media, we are using #NewMinisters. So feel free to join the conversation there. I'm going to start with a question to Lucy. Tell us what it was like entering government for the first time, and was it like anything you'd done before?
Tim, first of all, it's great to be here, and I think your events really do help people learn more, and it is essential that we all learn more all the time, especially in government, especially as ministers. And I think being in government and being appointed to government, like when you first become an MP, is like nothing you've ever done before. I was a barrister before I went to Parliament. And it's a huge honour to serve as a minister, and I think it's a huge opportunity to be able to deliver. We think that sometimes government is a difficult machine to operate, but it is absolutely possible to change people's lives, both as an MP and as a minister. But I'll just give you a little story about how different it is. So I remember one of my first conversations with my private office. So you walk into the room, you meet your private office, or your private secretary, and have a little one-to-one. And one of the first questions my first private secretary said to me was, what would you like to be called? And I said, well, I really didn't know what other answer there was to this question other than my name's Lucy. I'd quite like to be called Lucy. And he looked at me like quite aghast. And I said, what do you think I should be called? He said, I think people would like to call you Minister. And it's just a reminder about how different it is.
What did you go for?
Well, I tried to go for Lucy throughout my time because I felt that if you're minister, you're a position, you're not a person. And I wanted the civil service to feel like they could connect and trust and work with me, and that I wasn't this transitory person who was just sort of in the room for a period of time, which of course I was, but I wanted them to feel like I was working with them. And I think if people call you minister, it's putting the barrier between you and them.
You talked about these roles are a real opportunity to deliver and change people's lives. How easy is it, do you think, for ministers to kind of get beyond Whitehall and Westminster and, well, A, make the change, and B, see the change that they are making?
So I think it depends what department you're in and how much contact you have with the sectors that you're working with. So in culture, media and sport, one of the amazing things about that job is that there's huge engagement with the industry. They want you to be at their events, they want to talk to you, and there's such fabulous opportunities to go out and do stuff. When I was the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, responsible for tax, much more limited opportunity to speak to people because the Treasury were very nervous that if I talked to industry about what changes we were thinking about in tax, then that might move markets. And so much more limited opportunity to engage. So I think it really depends on who you are as a minister, but also what portfolio you've got.
Great, thank you. That's very interesting. James, so before you were a minister, you were an advisor in the policy unit in Tony Blair's number 10. What was it like making the transition from sort of that inside role to being a minister and being sort of on the front line of government?
Well, I suppose the transition goes policy unit, MP, then minister. And actually, policy unit to MP was probably the biggest, was much more of a change than policy unit to minister. Mm-hmm. When I was a very recently elected MP, it was just after the 75p increase in the pension. And we had to, a group of us local MPs had to talk to a group of pensioner groups. And I was visibly a bit nervous. So this much more experienced MP said, don't worry, James, I'll go first and I'll speak, and then they'll be much happier and you can come in on an easier wicket. And he started his speech by saying that he knew that this issue of pensions was very important for them because they didn't have very much time left. And I didn't have an easier time after that, frankly. I think there were some things that were very common. So actually, I think a really crucial but subtle thing in policy making is the difference between a policy and an initiative. You as a junior minister in particular, get lots of initiatives. You could do this and you could announce this, and actually, they often don't add up to a policy. And for me, a policy is you know what success would look like. You've got a reasonable chance of getting to that success with the levers that you're pulling or the money that you're spending, and you've got a way of delivering. And quite often the initiatives would never have any chance of making a difference to the thing you say you're trying to do. So I think that's common to being in a special advisor or a minister. I mean, there's lots and lots of differences. I think even as a junior minister, you're in a leadership role, which you're just not in the policy unit. And people are scrutinising what you're wearing, your demeanour. Are you called Lucy? Are you called Secretary of State? So thinking of yourself as a leader, and obviously if you're a parliamentary undersecretary, it's a very different type of leadership. It's much more supportive leadership, ideally, to your Secretary of State. It's much more managing upwards and managing peer relationships, but you are there as a leader. The other thing is time. I mean, obviously, being in the policy unit is incredibly busy, but I think the minute, and we were just talking before, it's got much worse, I think, since I was there. When I was there, we were going from a world where MPs went to their constituencies once every now and then to basically you were there the whole time. And then after I left, social media was just happening as I left, and I think, so carving out time, and I think in particular for a minister with a new private office, being very clear about what the non-negotiables are. If there was a Secretary of State who was very big into yoga when I was there, and if you want to do your Ashtanga yoga at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday, the system should serve you, and that's what you do. And you have to, it has to be non-negotiable, because the system in the end is not in the end there for you. In the end, it's there for the department. And unless you really insist, it will run around what the senior civil servants want in particular. So a good example of that, I think, is the box. The box will arrive at the time that it has been finished by the people writing the papers, which is mad, because that means the Secretary of State then gets it at 10 o'clock at night, or 9:45, and they're expected to bring it back at 8 the next morning. So, just the working out how you use your time and how you make sure that the non-negotiables aren't negotiated away.
There's so much in there. I want to pick up on the leadership point, though. Do you think a minister's expecting to be leaders inside the department when they take on these roles, particularly, as you say, maybe the more junior ministers, your first PUSS role? And is there more support that they would benefit from in those kind of roles?
I think it's often something that MPs don't think about, although ironically they are leaders in their constituencies and they're obviously trying to get votes, and so they're in your constituency, you're the sort of most influential person other than the decision maker on a vast range of issues. But yes, I think suddenly thinking yourself into, I am part of the leadership of this organisation. Obviously the Secretary of State's much more important than me, and the permanent secretary is, is managing the department in a different way, but you have to step up into a different way of thinking about yourself. I actually changed my mind a bit on the Lucy James versus minister thing. We obviously had Call Me Tony, so he was the first person not to be called Prime Minister, I think, which came from, I think, Alex Allen, who was the Principal Private Secretary, saying, well, why don't we call you Tony? But I ended up thinking that informality meant that both the good and the bad was more personalised around you as an individual, and actually being called Minister or Secretary of State meant that the authority came from the position rather than the person, and depersonalised it a little bit, so I sort of veered towards the more formal by the end.
And I think there's reports that the PM is referred to as the Prime Minister now, isn't he? He's not, I think, Sir Keir. But Kitty, what do you think when a PM is sort of setting up his or her team? What are they thinking about when they're appointing ministers and moving people around?
Well, not what you think they are. I think in an ideal world, it's a meritocracy where everyone with a science degree ends up at DSIT, and football fans like these two end up at DCMS. But actually, what the Prime Minister's doing is talking to the Chief Whip. It's all about the parliamentary management as much as it is the Whitehall management. So they're saying to the Chief Whip, where is the balance? Well, they probably know this, but they're talking to this. It's all about the discussion. It's like, where is the balance in the party? Where are the various factions? Where are the wings? Where do I need to pick someone from to satisfy this caucus, satisfy that caucus over there? I think maybe less so of this government than perhaps the last. I mean, kind of the really obvious example is Theresa May in the Brexit years, when her cabinet after the referendum was very specifically drawn from different wings of the party and equal leavers and remainers, to make sure that she couldn't be accused of bias either way. That turned out to be the leakiest cabinet. They would leak on their way in, they would leak on their way out. I mean, it was brilliant. But actually, yesterday when I was doing a bit of prep for this, I texted a whole bunch of ex-ministers, and one of them texted me back and said, "Never mistake reshuffles for meritocracy." I think they're a bit bitter. But that made me laugh because, these I've sat with the junior ministers on a day of a reshuffle, and they're always a bit anxious. They're sitting there, and if you're having a drink on the terrace or something, their phone will be on the table, and it'll be up, and occasionally one of their MP mates will prank them by withholding their number and going, this is number 10 switch. And then, and they kind of go off into a corner, and then they come back and they go, oh, for God's sake, happened again. So they're sort of anxiously waiting. Sorry, what was your question again?
I was going to say, what is the PM thinking about when?
What's the PM thinking about? Well, it depends how big the majority is. It's all about the parliamentary maths. So Keir Starmer had a whopping great majority, and therefore he could appoint young people that he knows personally. I'm thinking of people like Georgia Gould, who he knew from Camden, from North London politics, who in any other sort of government, however impressive she is, she's a new MP, right? So most MPs are given a chance to get their feet under the table, work out where the toilets are, get on a bill committee, and then, maybe a couple of years down the line get a job. And actually this did upset quite a lot of people who felt that they'd served their time, which goes back to the point about it's not a meritocracy, it's about personal relationships, and it's about where you sit in the party.
So can I ask the two MPs here, so when these kind of things are happening, how are you positioning, how are you trying to do you want to sort of make it obvious that you're interested? Like, what is that like?
I think everybody does it in very different ways. So there are people who are badgering the Prime Minister and the Chief Whip and everybody the whole time saying, I really think that I should be Secretary of State for Defence and, whatever it is that they ought to be. And everyone knows what they want and they make it very clear, particularly to the Prime Minister repeatedly. I think there are other people who think that they're just going to get there on merit. They've done a good job and that should be noticed. Largely they're women. I remember once someone in number 10 who worked in number 10 asked to see me just before a reshuffle, and she said to me, Lucy, all the men are repeatedly asking for the positions that they feel they ought to have. None of the women are asking for anything. So I think there's a balance, which is I think sometimes it's counterproductive to be asking the whole time for a position. I think it's important that it is known discreetly what you might want to do, and then you just have to leave it to see whether that happens. But I do think there's an advantage in subtly identifying what you might be interested in. Never transpires, by the way. But I think it's silly to do nothing and silly to do too much.
Yeah.
I agree. Don't badger. I mean, honestly, if you just become annoying, unless you're incredibly politically powerful, then it's just going to make you less likely to get a job. I think it's good, it's good to be known. They have to know who you are, particularly when there's so many backbench Labour MPs as there are now. And I think being known for some specific things means it's a bit more likely you might get put into. Tony, for whom reshuffles weren't his greatest strength, did put me into I was in DWP and DCMS, and I'd done DCMS for him in the policy unit, and I'd done the select committee on work and pension. So there was a bit of a logic to that. So I think, be known, be appreciated and liked by as many of the people who are going to be taking the decision as possible, except it's massively random. Your name might fall off the board. I mean, that's been known to happen. Or, when they're doing the more junior ministerial roles, maybe that person who's your biggest fan gets called away to deal with something else. So accept the randomness. And then when you're asked, a question reminds me, the night before I resigned, Peter Donaldson rang me up and said, so Gordon's going to put Ed in the Treasury tomorrow, and so he wanted to know if you wanted to be Secretary of State for Health or for Education. But I'd already decided I was resigning at that point, but I did. It was difficult. My whole family are teachers, and I'd love to do education, so I did tell him, but didn't tell him I was resigning the next day.
Kitty, what is it like? I mean, do people use or try and use journalists to sort of position themselves?
Oh.
Tell us about that.
I remember texting once the Secretary of State, who was very grand, very a conservative, let's say, and saying, have you heard these rumours about the reshuffle? Literally, phone rang a second later. What have you heard? I know who's spreading these rumours. I know who it is. 5 minutes later, I was kind of like, okay. I think it's fine. I think you sort of end up in a kind of slightly what's the word? Therapeutic role sometimes.
Like a counsellor.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, I mean, actually, there's quite a lot of fun to be had in the run up to reshuffles. I mean, there's a sort of negative side, the negative briefings that you get from people in government, settling scores, number 10. A lot of that's been playing out in the early months of this year, gone away a bit now. But then in the run-up to the reshuffle, you'll see these brilliant stories where, this kind of random name you've never heard of will be tipped for top office. And then you'll think, did I spot them having a drink last night with that journalist? And it's a bit like a kind of party leadership contest where, the kind of Raymond Chishti, no offence, chucks his name into the ring just so people go, sorry, who? It's that kind of, if not now, then me in the future sort of. It's quite a fun game to watch, and you can sort of go, oh, that's nice.
Brill. I mean, the IFG loves talking about reshuffles. We could happily keep talking about that all day. But obviously, one of the things that reshuffles mean is new ministers arriving in departments, and potentially they might not know anything about the policy area. They might actually have quite different views to their predecessor in post, which can mean a lot of sort of redirection for the organisation. Lucy, perhaps you did. I think you said you did 9 ministerial jobs in your time in government. What's it like constantly moving between departments, and how did you find that process of getting up to speed and building your sort of position on different issues?
Yeah, so I had 9 jobs in 6 different departments over 6 years. So I got up to speed regularly, and I do. So I think it's really important. I mean, on day one in a job, you could be doing oral questions, you could be before a select committee, you might be before the media. So you basically have to know your job pretty immediately. I mean, you've got sort of a week-ish leeway, but after that you haven't, and you might not even have that. I mean, the media isn't hugely forgiving. So you've got to get up to speed very quickly. I mean, the way I did that was I would read quite a lot. I was a barrister, so I was used to reading huge amounts. I'd ask for lots of reports, but also a lot of engagement. So I did it when I was appointed as Secretary of State for DCMS. I immediately did round tables with every sector and subsector to listen to what their asks were, so that I knew what I ought to be delivering and hear directly from them as to what they wanted me to do. And I think, I mean, 9 sounds a lot, and it was, but I learned on the way. So when luckily I had my first 3 years in every single role in the Justice Department. So I started off in a department where I kind of knew the subject matter, but I had to learn how to deal with the civil service and empower them and get the most out of our relationship. I had to learn how to deal with all the ministers in the department, had to understand the portfolio, had to understand how to deal with SPADs, understand what was political and what could be delivered by the civil service. So, you know, you learn those basics, and they're true whichever department you're in, and then you've just got to pick up the subject matter.
Mm-hmm. How did you find it, James?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think ideally you define yourself quite early, because otherwise something can happen and you become defined by the problem, and then it's very hard to get out of that. If people don't know the broad direction you're trying to lead the department, then when things go wrong, that becomes kind of all you're known for. So I always wanted to try and get out of the gates pretty quickly, but obviously that's harder if you don't already know it. If you're sort of making it up, that can also be a problem. You can get out the gates quickly and then regret it. So when I went to DWP, we'd had a period of being a bit less pro-welfare reform, and I wanted to signal that that was going to change. And so actually we were sort of brainstorming ideas, and actually a civil servant suggested, well, John Hutton had David Freud as an advisor, maybe we could bring him back, and that would show, you know, we were going back to that idea of the approach to the policy, and in some ways that worked quite well. It did sort of signal, people sort of knew I was a pro-welfare reform Secretary of State. David was a brilliant but complicated character, and it had its own niceties, shall we say, as we went along. But you know, it's inevitably a jump into the unknown. There's very few jobs where you're suddenly propulsed into being right at the top of an organisation without ever having had any experience in it.
Absolutely, and this is something we talk about here at the IFG a lot. So, Kitty, from your point of view, what are the skills that you think ministers need, particularly when they're sort of taking on these high-profile leadership roles?
Well, in my text correspondence yesterday with everyone who was dying to tell me about their experience in government, the first one seems to be make friends with your private office pretty smartish. As Lucy was saying, you've got a week. Someone said it to me, you've actually got 2 days before the vultures start circling. Always read everything and always read to the bottom, and then someone said to me you can always reference something like 3 pages in, which apparently impresses civil servants that you've actually read it. But I would also say try. I mean, and the other thing that struck me from these conversations I was having is trying to balance Parliament, your obligations there with your obligations to as James was saying, to your constituency, but also to the department. And actually, someone said to me, civil service don't really understand Parliament. They don't really see the point of it. They're focused on what they're doing. And actually, when I work in Parliament, I spend a lot of time talking to MPs, and actually keeping those people on side is as, if not more important than the department, because if we look at this coming next couple of weeks, we've got the welfare bill, and what we've seen is members of the DWP out and about on the Commons terrace, talking to people, making sure that colleagues are on site, or finding out where the issues are. Is it PIP? Is it, return to work, whatever the issues are, and having the kind of conversation, because you can end up with a sort of parliamentary groupthink, which you can then try and get away from if you're interacting enough. And so you've got to put enough time in, if it's for a minister, you've got to put enough time in your diary in order to do that. Because very quickly you get the ministers get accused of being aloof and unavailable. And it's probably not that, it's just that they're busy. But you're also sort of managing the kind of the irritation of the people who didn't get ministerial roles, so the backbenchers who think I'd be better at that than they are. So you've got to sort of, smooth feathers as well.
Yeah. James, does that tally with your experience of the civil service not understanding why Parliament matters and why ministers want to spend time there?
I think they sort of understand in theory, but is it more important than that meeting with the stakeholder group or the permanent secretary or whatever? So, yeah, I think it goes back to the point about things being non-negotiable. You sort of have to try and work out where you want to spend the balance of your time. And if managing Parliament's an important thing, then it has to be blocked out in your diary, and you have to confront what it means you're going to do less of, definitely.
Yeah.
I would say, so I think all categories are important. So there's the civil service who are delivering for you and with you, the stakeholders who are your external, that's who you're affecting in the country, and then there's Parliament who you need to work with, and you need to do all of those. So I did bills, I did the House, very briefly the housing minister. I spoke to 90 of my colleagues as the housing legislation went through the House. I think the thing about, and it is probably true that the civil service don't appreciate the importance of Parliament, because I think maybe they sometimes think that's political engagement, because largely you're speaking to your own party and they're slightly nervous. Well, we can't set up calls only with your side if we're not doing it with the other side. And I think different departments have a view on that, but it isn't. It's about delivering your legislation, so it should be within their sort of mindset.
One of the other things that came out there was about time and the lack of time in general. You were saying beforehand sort of how busy your diary was. How do you think ministers can get on top of the diary and make sure it's working for them rather than just facing this onslaught of...
So it's really, really critical, because you could say nothing and do nothing, and the civil service would feel it was their duty to fill your diary up and tell you hundreds of visits you ought to go on. So you have to be absolutely rigorous about what are your priorities, what do you want to deliver, and who do you need to talk to in order to deliver those, and that's what you need to do. And I didn't have any meeting. There was very few meetings that were longer than 30 minutes, and they were all back to back, because I decided after 30 minutes people just start repeating the same thing. Because it's very interesting. I'm reading Tony Blair's book at the moment on leadership, and he said that Bill Clinton gave him one piece of advice when he became Prime Minister, which was the most important thing is the schedule. And I think is absolutely true, because if you can't focus on what you're meant to be doing, you're just not going to deliver it.
And there was a good trick in number 10, which the diary, I don't know if they still do it, but the diary team would say to the Foreign Office, this is the number of hours that you've got per week. And so you prioritise between the President of Peru and the Prime Minister of Italy. And so that it doesn't, there are some things which are hard to say no to, and they can just, and actually stakeholder groups can be exactly that. I think the stakeholder management, particularly at DCMS, is incredibly important. But there's a world, I completely agree with what Lucy said, you have to know your priorities. And there's one chief of staff to an American president who said priorities are like hands. If you've got more than two, you're insane. And you knowing, I think you can flex that a little bit. And there's different types of priorities. I think there's the big things you're trying to do in your time in the department. And then there's the sort of more medium, or sometimes it's a passion thing that you want to sort out this particular opera house in this particular place, or whatever it might be, or change a piece of legislation on women's pensions, But knowing what those two big things are, and then making sure that your time is focused on that, and then I think using the system, using your ministers, working out what you have confidence in delegating to whom, and then using your SPADs. Being incredibly careful with who your SPADs are, because they are going to be the people who will be the gearbox between you and the department getting things done. And so choosing them not on loyalty, but choosing them on are they going to be good at this job in this department is incredibly important.
I'm aware of Lucy's 30-minute rule, so I want to come to questions from the audience shortly. But I wanted to pick up on the SPAD's point, because you both were Secretaries of State. Secretaries of State, generally speaking, are the only ministers who get special advisors.
Yep.
Few other ministers do. Lucy, first, what did you look for in special advisors, and what do you think they enabled you to do that you couldn't do as a more junior minister without them?
Special advisors are absolutely critical, and I don't think you can function well if you don't have good ones. And I was very lucky to have 3 excellent special advisors. I think you have to think, what is the special advisor there for? Because it's very easy when the civil service aren't delivering how you want them to deliver, even though they're brilliant, to just ask the SPADs to do it. But that's not what they're there for. They are there for political engagement and to be the liaison with the political office in number 10. And that's how I tried to use them to, I mean, obviously they did a whole range of other things as well and engaged with stakeholders, but I tried to use them for what they were there for, that no one else in that building could deliver. And it's quite hard to get special advisors, as in lots of people get them through contacts. There's no place you can advertise, and they are very, very important.
And Kitty, do you have a sense of how ministers sort of view special advisors well, or is to James's point about loyalty, is there sort of sometimes a sense of picking the people you know rather than the people who might be best at this role?
Well, there have been certain instances of number 10 imposing SPADs on people because they want control over departments, which I don't think is necessarily a good thing. I think actually I was talking to one former Secretary of State yesterday who said that they cancelled the passes of all number 10 into their building because there were lots of ambitious little characters all wandering around trying to report directly back to number 10, and the Secretary of State didn't think it was quite on for this to be happening. I view, as a journalist, SPADs as fundamental to the ecosystem, because I think there's been a downgrading of the Whitehall press machine in the last 10, 15 years, in that you used to be able to ring up and get a decent answer from even a junior desk officer who would talk to you on background and say, this is the policy on, I don't know, Iran or Israel, whatever, pensions, whatever. And there are still some people who are good at that, but I think that was undermined and hollowed out, and to the point where there's no point, because they'll just say, put it in an email, you email, and 4 hours later you might get a reply, you might not get a reply. It's much easier just to text a SPAD saying, is this government policy? And if you're lucky and you've got a good relationship with them, and they'll say, yes, no, have you thought about this? Which is much easier and less time consuming than going through the Whitehall machine.
That's interesting, isn't it? And the sort of, the balance between the political and the official side of things.
I mean, to your source, I think something's gone quite badly wrong when you get to that point.
Probably.
So as the number 10, I don't know, policy person who used to work in departments.
It wasn't James they banned.
I think in an ideal world, the SPAD teams between the policy unit and the department are quite enmeshed with each other, and they know their different roles. The SPADs have got to be there for the Secretary of State. I really worry about imposing a SPAD, because in the end, when things are going wrong, those are the people you want to be able to close the door and have a completely honest conversation. And if you don't believe that person is there because you wanted them, I think that would make that quite a complex conversation. But when I was working with Chris Smith, for example, I was very clearly representing number 10 and Tony, but I would also be helping him to get his stuff through, like in the spending review. We would work very closely with his team to make arguments within number 10 and with the Treasury. Ed Miliband and I worked on that because Ed was in charge of the DCMS spending at his end. So I think, obviously it does work like that sometimes, but I think they've really lost an ability to oil the wheels between the SPADs if they do that.
That sounds like an example of functional government.
That was quite functional, yes, I agree. Although, I mean, Gordon and Tony obviously didn't, but and actually the SPADs are often a way some SPADs will exaggerate the divisions and differences between their Secretaries of State, and some will try and find ways of making it work. And again, the second is more helpful.
Absolutely. I'm going to come to audience questions. We have more discussion up here, but we have a roving mic.
I should just say, because my SPAD, I've just noticed, is in the room.
Oh, okay.
And also worth James saying, I'm just going to reiterate how brilliant my SPADs are.
Maybe we can hear more about your point of view shortly as well. But yeah, please, if you have questions, do stick up your hand. My colleague Lauren has a mic. If you can say who you are, I'll take questions in a group of 3, I think, and then we'll come to online shortly.
Thank you. My name is Greg Power. I run an organisation called GPG, which works with ministers, officials, politicians in developing post-conflict fragile states. I was also 20 years ago a special advisor, so thank you for your kind comments, for Robin Cook and Peter Hain. And the question I wanted to ask, the thing which, of my experience of working with ministers is, as you've all mentioned, it's the evaporation of time when you become a minister and your control of the diary. And I was particularly keen to understand how you preserve the time to think, because the difference between effective ministers and ineffective ministers is that ability to think strategically, to think about the long term, your priorities, what you're trying to achieve. And if you lose that time, you tend to just become tactical. You're responding to events and immediately just firefighting the whole time. So I just wondered, from your experience, how you preserve that time, especially for James, who went from the policy unit where you're doing almost all thinking to being a minister where you're struggling to find that time to think.
Well, good question. Thank you very much. Jill, over here.
Hi, I'm Jill Rutter from here. You've been in a number of departments, and I just wondered if you might say how different you thought departmental cultures were, how difficult that was when you arrived somewhere else and discovered that there was a different mindset, if you think that's true. And during your time as ministers, if you didn't thought there were aspects of better departmental culture you'd seen elsewhere, did you actually sort of manage to succeed in changing the way in which departments went about their business and went about working with you?
Well, thank you. There's a question here.
Hi, mine's more really a statement than a question. It's probably blindingly obvious, but going back to your civil servants, when they asked you what you wanted to be called, just as someone who's worked around ministers and sort of senior people in politics, it's really quite important that you do stick to that minister or mayor or whatever, because it reminds you to respect the position, even if you don't always respect the individual holding that position. And secondly, not going into first names, which can easily happen. If you've got someone charismatic, like, for example, Boris Johnson, all the press are calling him Boris. If you start to call him Boris, whether you mean it or not, it looks like you're politically aligned, and it just helps to undermine the independence that you might be trying to demonstrate in your organisation. So,
What was your name, sorry?
my name's Janet Cook.
Janet, thank you. Thank you. Interesting. Okay, who would like to take the first one about how do you preserve time to think? We've talked a bit about this, but...
I can see there's no flurry of excitement to take this. I mean, I think, I always failed. I mean, my private office called me Lucy, but no one else did. And that's probably why. So I do understand that point. So look, time to think is really hard. It's really hard to find time to think because you're just busy. I mean, especially in a department like DCMS where you're doing sport, culture, the arts, creative industry, everything, and you're going from one meeting to another meeting on totally different subject. So I think, well, first of all, as I said, I read a lot, so I think as I was reading, but I thought with others during meetings. So when I had a round table with the industry, that was a chance for me to test what I was thinking with them. And I would constantly in meetings just have a series of questions, which was really my time to be sort of reflecting. So I suppose I doubled up on thinking and meeting. But you're right, it's impossible. I was just saying before, I used to think in the shower. That was my thinking time.
Yes, I agree. I think your prioritisation helps. So if you have got a clear set of priorities and you've got junior ministers or SPADs or civil servants that you think, right, I can actually just give that to them and it's going to come back to me and I can check So I think that helps. Completely agree about using the time in your diary to help you think. So round tables, or, you can do any kind of visit, but a visit, for me, a visit that was really important was shadowing some people in a job centre once and seeing people who are coming in with a very significant stutter, who were on the guy was on JSA, and basically understanding this person was just being made to do work-focused interviews over and over again, and it wasn't helping him. That was helpful because we were thinking about that particular topic at the time. Don't go to the constituency every Friday. It's fine. No one's really watching in the end. Try and use some of that time for thinking. And then back to the discipline about it's your time. And it is about making sure that the schedule works for you, and it will work for you if you insist, but otherwise it'll work for the department and the senior civil servant, so you have to make it work for you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Kitty, I want to put this question about different departmental cultures to you, to see if this is something that you've discussed with ministers, or perhaps any of the people you're in touch with over the weekend. What do you think the sort of, maybe the stereotypes that ministers have about different bits of Whitehall are?
I think there's a stereotype that DCMS is a ministry for laughs. Even though everyone works there, I'm glad at my place that it's the fun job and that everyone really wants all the free tickets, etc. Which I know is not true. Just don't.
Serious economic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Growth sector. Yeah. I mean, if you go into places like the Ministry of Defence, it's sort of you are in a kind of weird other world, because you've got lots of people wandering around in uniform with, endless medals, endless epaulets on, and then they treat the civil servants as if they were military, and some of them are military, for instance, but quite a lot aren't. And actually, the ones who aren't are given a ranking, I think. So you can be a sort of middle-ranking press officer and be a major, which really winds up proper majors, as you can imagine. And I think it's that sort of, it must be quite odd to go from one to the other. And DWP, of course, is a very interesting department in the sense it's community-based, isn't it? It's the only kind of department that has a sort of shop in every community, as it were. And I think the staff go in and out of job centres and so forth, don't they? So there's a kind of rolling that I feel that there's more of a sort of link between. I don't even want to use the phrase real world, because that would imply that making munitions isn't the real world. But do you see what I mean? There's a kind of community-based sense in one, and perhaps a slightly more highbrow abstract in the other.
Yes, I think the departments where something goes really, really badly wrong if you don't do your job properly. Yeah. So DWP and Defence, I think, are at that end.
Yeah.
People don't get their benefits. That's a really. Yeah. I think they do end up being more delivery focused at some level, and the ones like DCMS, where the delivery is mostly done elsewhere, can end up being a bit more the policy stakeholder sort of difference between. It's a difference of degree, but I'll exaggerate it to make the point, between keeping people happy and making things work. I think that can be a difference. I think in the end, the core of being minister is pretty similar everywhere. You just need to flex it to the different environment that you're in, and not think you know everything just because you were tremendous success at MOJ or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I would say, I've been in lots of departments. I'd say the Treasury is distinct. The Attorney General's office, because it's so small, is distinct, and it's just full of lawyers. And then I think the rest are just a variant of the same in terms of culture, as in they're more similar together than those other two. I've never been in Defence or DWP, so I can't come on that. And just in terms of changing culture, I think it's very difficult for a Secretary of State to change the culture of a department. I think what a Secretary of State can do is empower the civil servants to want to deliver for the ministers in the programme that they are doing, by being interested and engaged in the parts of the civil service, every part. So many people in the civil service in a department are doing a whole range of things. that often won't have much contact with ministers. And I think if the minister can find some way to demonstrate how important those things are to them and to the country, I think they can help empower delivery.
Brill. Okay, thank you very much. Let's take some of the questions from online. So, first question from Professor Dakshana Sivayoganathan. Excuse me for mispronouncing if I have. In your experience, what distinguishes those who go on to become great ministers, especially early in their careers, and what more can be done to develop this talent from the backbenches or even outside Westminster? James Hutchcraft, so what goes on to distinguish great ministers? James Hutchcraft asks, how do you juggle what you want to do or achieve as a minister with your party political responsibilities, especially if the two are in conflict? And someone anonymous, I think we can probably guess what they do for a job, says, what do you feel makes a great civil servant? And what do you need to have confidence in their ability to deliver on policy and initiatives? So, great ministers, great civil servants, and party versus government responsibilities. James, perhaps start with you.
Great civil servants, it's hard to answer in the abstract because it depends what they're doing. But I suppose the ones who come most into contact with ministers are more at the policy end. So I think actually knowing what a policy is and isn't and being able to develop sort of overall solutions and being able to talk truth to the minister whilst also subtly conveying that they recognise that it's for the minister to decide. So I think, really good policy skills, but also really good interpersonal skills. Sense of humour can be really helpful. I had a brilliant principal private secretary called John Oliver at DWP who was very good at taking the piss out of me when I was being an idiot in private, and that was a very, ministers can get very steamed up about the department's just not doing what I want, and you can end up insisting on something really stupid to get your own way, and so finding humour to try and stop you from doing that is good. But actually, maybe to duck the question a bit, one of the good and interesting things about DWP is because, actually to continue with John, he'd been their man and boy. He arrived at 17 or 18. He had been, a fraud inspector in Glasgow. He'd worked in the CSA, when there was a backlog. So, having the mixture of policy, analytical, and delivery skills was a really good thing in DWP. I won't do all of them, otherwise I'll go on forever. But I think the tension between parliamentary representation in your party and what you want to do is one to embrace. You can sort of think you've been plucked from Olympian heights to come and do this vital job and only you can do it, but you're there representing a group of MPs who represent a group of people who voted for them. And so, thinking creatively about the balance between what you've been elected to do and what you think is the right thing is one of the important things about being a minister.
Great. Kitty, what do you think about this question about what distinguishes those who go on to become great ministers? Is it easy to spot early on?
Yeah, I think it is actually quite easy.
Yeah.
But I don't... It's usually about how someone holds themselves, how they communicate, how self-confident they are. Quite a lot of new MPs look like rabbits in headlights when you meet them, and they go, "Oh, I don't like talking to the press," and you think, "Oh, get a grip, come on." I think sort of knowing how, I can always tell from I've talked to a new MP, and every new Parliament, we take everyone for coffee, and after a while you start realising who will rise because they're not scared of their own shadow. They make their own priorities even as a junior MP. They talk to people not just in their own party but all around. They make alliances on issues, and they're sort of building up a network. And it's not sort of the kind of clipboard, momentum, Labour sort of organising. It's more subtle than that. It's more kind of, I'm trying out ideas with people. I'm embracing. I'm going to events where I will meet people who disagree with me. I'm not refusing to take phone calls because you're a bit scary. It's the kind of people who will lean into difficult decisions, I guess. And I've met a few MPs who I think you are never going to make minister. I'm not going to name any.
Were you always right?
Was I always right? That's a really good question. Probably not. But I think if they got to minister, I congratulated myself on being right. But the ones that fall by the wayside, you think, you don't really think about them, do you?
It's a harsh world out there.
Yeah, it is.
Lucy.
So I think I agree with what Kitty's just said in terms of, to the outside world is really important, and generally it's important to be able to hold yourself and to have that confidence. I think a minister should also listen and deliver. So I think it's really important. We're all here to serve the country. That's why we've taken public office. And in order to do that job well, you have to understand what people want you to do, and your party wants you to do, and what your manifesto committed you to do, and then you need to get on and deliver it. I think that's really, really critical. So I don't think there's much difference between what makes a good civil servant. Well, I think there's a key component which is joined between what makes a good civil servant and what makes a good minister, and that is listening. So the civil servants need to listen to the minister and to the government as to what are they being asked to deliver, not their own pet project, which they've been working on for 3 years, that they really enjoy, is listening to what is actually being asked of them and then helping to make sure that that is delivered as well. And then just to the point about the party versus politics, I think James might be a constituent of mine, so sorry if that's wrong, but hi James, and thanks for your question if that's right. So I think the different, ex-constituent, no longer an MP. I think the thing about, I totally agree with what James said. We are, when elected, we are elected for a party that stood on a manifesto, and you can't then run your own course. And I always equate it with a football team. If you're unhappy, if you're playing on a football team, and you're a member of Chelsea, and you're unhappy with how you're being directed and what your coach or your manager is saying, you don't go and shoot for the other side. However frustrated you are, you go and you talk internally and you resolve your problems internally. You don't go on the media and say, I disagree with this, that, and the other. Because you're there, you're a team, and you ought to be delivering as a team. Otherwise, you're all booted out.
Did that always work?
Well, there are a few people, I don't know whether you know who they might be, who didn't always do that. And it damaged us as a party. And so I think that's, people think it doesn't, or they think that they're, anyway,
I think we're already seeing that with the Labour administration when the Angela Rayner memo about tax rises leaked or have plans for tax rises. I mean, that is extremely unhelpful.
Yeah.
It's great for us but what is great for Copy is not great for the country, and it's not great for the Labour Party, not great for the government, because it's sort of playing, family squabbles out loud.
Yeah.
And I always sort of think it's quite selfish because you're putting yourself above the needs of the party, and you're not being a team player, actually.
I mean, the number of times when I knocked on doors in the last election, why were people not voting for us? Party division came up time and time again.
And potentially something that gets worse through the length of a government
Yeah.
I'm going to take one quick round of questions in the room, if we can keep them brief, please, before we finish. Gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Vincenzo. Just to pick up on a couple of things that Lucy said that were really interesting. One was about showing civil servants that you're interested, then also that they needed to show that they're listening. I think thinking prior experiences, one of the hardest things was to really get a sense of what your minister was really thinking about a topic and what the landing zone for an issue might be. You can read all the government strategies and on all the kind of mood music around a topic, but really knowing that. So I wanted to ask just kind of what were your favourite techniques to make sure that people really knew your mind on topics? Or if you would have your time again, what would you do differently to make sure people really knew where you wanted to land on particular issues?
Well, thank you. Great question. Here at the front. And then.
How can a minister deliver long-term change when you're often appointed on quite a short-term basis? Because I can think of ministers like Michael Gove in education who brought about significant change to the curriculum, whereas other ministers may not be as successful in that respect.
Bill, what was your name, sorry?
Gabriella.
Gabriella, thank you. And one at the back there.
Andrew Smith. James talked about backbenchers looking at you and thinking they could do the job a lot better. But what about at the cabinet table? You look around at struggling colleagues. What advice did you? What were they? Were there any themes about what they were doing that was resulting in them struggling? And what advice did you have for them, or do you have for them?
Great. I'm actually going to save that one as my last question to close. So we'll come to advice. But other questions. So perhaps, James and Lucy, techniques to make sure people knew what you wanted, and then perhaps everyone on the long-term change with short-term roles.
It's a great question. I think that point about definition. So as a Secretary of State, you won't talk to most of your civil servants, probably ever. You certainly won't talk to them every day. So painting in sort of big colours so they know broadly this is the direction the Secretary of State or this minister wants to go in. Easier for the Secretary of State. I think as you become more junior, it becomes more about being really straightforward in a kind way with your civil servants. You are there to decide, so you don't have to be horrible, but you can sort of say what you want. At some point, and then in the end, you can write it yourself if you want to. I once rewrote a white paper over a weekend because it just wasn't ever getting where I wanted it, and everyone hated that, but it was sort of a consequence of having had weeks and weeks of trying to get there, and maybe I wasn't explaining it well, maybe civil servants weren't listening, so there are different things you can do. I think it's a team sport, actually, and to the point about you're there representing a party in a manifesto, you very rarely are there at the start of anything and at the end of it, almost never. So Ian Duncan-Smith might be an example of that, but he was rare in being imposed or Gordon, when he was Chancellor, was there but I think only 3 ministers, Tony Gordon and Tommy McAvoy, were in the same role all the way through that Labour government. So I think you have to accept, A, that quite often you are maybe inheriting the delivery stage of something that was designed by a predecessor. And also it speaks to cross-party working. The things which I did, which survived the longest and have had the biggest impact, are the things that the Conservatives agreed with when they came in. So I think that's one way. But I think mostly not trying to think it's all about you is the best way of thinking about how you get things done.
Lucy?
Yeah, I agree with that. Just in terms of how do you deliver your message, I think you've got to be very clear in everything you do and not be overambitious and have 25 things that you want to or message. I had 3 key themes and I just talked about them all the time. And I think those opportunities when you speak to the department, you do the all-staff things, they're quite important because that's where you're saying your story. Even if you're only getting 5 minutes, you can get a feel for what the Secretary of State is really all about. I as a Secretary of State, I don't know whether this happened, but I was always very keen to ensure that whoever was working on the project was in the room. I didn't need to meet the DG, and the most important people. I needed to meet the people who were delivering it. Obviously, I wasn't in charge of who was coming to the meeting, so I don't know to what extent that was fulfilled, but I think that is really important. And then your question about long-term change is very valuable question and a very difficult one. Michael Gove was in that position in shadow, had worked out exactly what he wanted to deliver and enacted some of it, within weeks of coming into the post. And as James said, we don't often get those opportunities to do that long-term change. We're often picking up a policy midway through. But I think that you can still start things that you might not see through. I see some things coming out of my department now, which were things that we started. So I don't think ministers should be put off by the fact that they might be moved on during the course of the journey. All you can do is do the job you're given at the time you're given it as well as possible and think as long term as you can. George Osborne gave me and a number of other people some advice, which I try to give others, which is 80% of your job anyone can do. Like whoever's in post at that time, it's going to happen, whatever, because it's going to be delivered by the civil service. It was always in train. what you have to think about as a minister is what is the 20%, it might be even smaller than that, that you bring, that only you, if you were in that post, are going to achieve, and try and prioritise and work on that, because that's the change that you will deliver personally.
Great. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the last question then. So picking up on that final question about advice for ministers who are struggling, but perhaps broadening it out to advice for new ministers in general. Say there is a reshuffle at the end of the summer, someone is in their first Secretary of State role or in their first ministerial role, full stop. What would each of your advice be to that person? Perhaps I will start with Kitty and then...
Well, this is easy when you go into government, but bring out the dead, make sure that you find a £22 billion black hole in whichever department you're in, and whatever it is, to be honest, and say this was the last lot. Look at this mess. Very important, both politically and internally. I think it's sort of, and then, but also then you're aware of where all the pitfalls are, I guess. I guess other one is don't bully anyone. That would be quite nice.
Solid advice.
Solid. I think that stands the test. That one.
What about relationships with the media?
Yeah, just ring me. Yeah.
Answer Kitty's
Only
phone
ring
call.
me. Exactly. I do actually. There's a kind of wider point actually, and I've been saying this to this government quite a lot. Is there is a sort of more narrative thing that ministers aren't, or departments aren't very good at doing, which is. You'll get an announcement on the day, whatever it is, but you can prepare the ground. You can tell a better story, I think, if you bring people in and explain what you're doing earlier in the process. And where I think this government's sort of fallen down on its media strategy is that the Tories had William Hague and Michael Howard and other kind of greybeards to be the outriders. This government, I don't think, is particularly. I think your government had like people from the IPPR and so forth. I can't really remember, but people who would set out the kind of the intellectual case for what you're doing, rather than just dropping a policy on the day. And I think as a Secretary of State, you can get people to do that for you.
That strategic plan, yeah, great. Thank you. That's really interesting. James, your advice.
So I agree with that last point. I think sort of the washing line of what you're trying to do, what are the things you're doing, where you're trying to get to, so people can put it all together. Speeches, make more speeches. It's interesting. Wes Streeting made a great speech last week. Really interesting, cohesive argument. You can sort of agree or disagree with it, but this may be me being an old person, but I noticed far fewer speeches actually than.
I think that's true.
So I feel like I was making a speech every week to the SMF or the CJS or whoever it might have been, CSJ. And we've covered a lot of it, so I won't repeat all of it. But I think if it's Secretary of State, make friends with your permanent secretary. If that relationship doesn't work, you're toast, basically. So that is a really important relationship. Use your private secretary to make sure that relationship works well. But yeah, know what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and then have a group of people who you trust, you can have a real conversation with. And that might be, for me it was Andy Burnham and other people, David and people in the cabinet. Those relationships can be close and friendships, but they're also a bit complicated by competition and politics. So, who are the people you can pick the phone up to and go, is this right, is this not right? Well, that's important.
Great. Lucy, final
All
word.
great advice. I'm going to give two bits, I think. One is a point Kitty made. I mean, it took me a long time to work out how to work with the media. And and it wasn't really till I was Secretary of State that I realised that it was a symbiotic relationship which we could both get something out of. So I think trusting a little bit more and working out how you work with the media is something quite important, especially in this day and age. And then the second piece of advice I would have is be nice to everybody, particularly those people who've not been promoted and been sacked. In fact, remember them more than the people amongst your colleagues who have been promoted, because it's a tough game and it's a hard game, and they're all your colleagues and friends. And often the people who haven't been promoted and been sacked will also subsequently be promoted. I mean, it's a sort of a ladder that goes up and down. So I think, don't forget anybody, is my advice.
Very, very useful advice. Thank you. This has been really interesting. We could keep talking, but I'm going to close it here. I just want to say on Thursday this week, we are having a conference talking about ethics and standards in public life. We are hoping to get a government minister to give a speech. We should have information about that online shortly. And Sir John Major will be here as well. So even if we don't get a government minister, it'll be a fantastic day. There will be a video and sound recording of today's event online shortly. So if you'd like to watch this back or share with anyone, please do. And I will just end by asking you to join me in thanking the panel.